Hello, everybody. I'm excited about tonight's opera in particular because, in general, we don't really talk about music prior to 1650, even sometimes 1700. And it's hard, or becoming increasingly easy to find music and recordings of this era of, the Renaissance, of the early Baroque, and of the Middle Ages and even earlier. So tonight's opera is Poppea, the L'Incoronazione di Poppea by Claudio Monteverdi, who is considered the first great opera composer. And this is a particularly unique opera because of the many ways that it defies convention, considering that convention did not exist really, that it was a brand new genre, that, the Baroque actually is defined by the invention of opera. This is sort of an interesting way that it sort of is a prototype, almost like from his first opera, L'Orfeo, about Orpheus, to the coronation of Poppea, which is a thoroughly modern opera by sort of in terms of the scale of how long operas existed, for about 400 years. This is a particularly interesting one to study because it has so many of these archetypes that we've been discussing over the last year. But we're going to be talking in particular about the way that Monteverdi uses musical structure in tandem with drama, because you see, let's see, let me if I can get this started. Let's see if I remember how to do this. Let's move this. Oh, okay. You can't see what I'm doing, but I have the little Zoom bar going. Should be slideshow. There we go. So back to Monteverdi. The big part of Renaissance philosophy, as many of you probably know, was a revisiting of classical philosophy, art, and drama, and music by extension of that. Of course, this is very late Renaissance when Monteverdi is coming onto the scene, but it still is relevant to know because he was born into that culture. He was born in the 1500s. And it's also important to know how bound music and poetry were considered at that time. That music was sort of an extension of poetry and vice versa. So that the setting of text to music was seen as sort of a natural impulse, as again, as an extension of each other. Because if you think about it, of course, they are bound by the same constraints, which could be viewed as musical or poetic. Time, sound, rhythm, meter, and syntax are all things that we use to describe the rhetoric used in both forms. And this was very much part of what we call humanist philosophy. Now, the first operas were commissioned by a group called the Florentine Camerata, who were seeking to recreate Greek drama. And this is important because this was all speculative on their part. They knew that the Greeks used music and were able to bind words and music together in a way that supposedly created this incredible drama. And they wanted to recreate what that sound, that experience, that dramatic unfolding, what that would be like. And this is sort of the founding principle of what opera is. It's a recreation of Greek drama. And again, central to this is the tenet of this text-music relationship. And the first known opera to be composed was by Jacopo Peri, Daphne, which is now lost, unfortunately. But we know from accounts that it is predominantly in two forms of music, madrigal and monody. And now a madrigal is a setting, usually, of a poem to a chorus, that is to say, a choir of voices, so soprano, alto, tenor, bass, for example, that together paint the picture of what is happening in the poem through literal depiction. That is to say, if it uses the word running, there will be a set of very fast notes that happen. This is a very basic, simple madrigalism, is what we call it, to sort of artful expression of sorrow, of grief, or of happiness. All these sort of like basic evocations of core emotions in a choral setting, usually again one to a part, sort of a chamber-like feeling. And monody, which is essentially an aria. It's basically vocal not recitation, but can be recitation, singing to a simple accompaniment. And this was an invention of a prior composer, Caccini, who was again interested in actually completely divorcing himself from this complicated, what we call polyphonic setting, which is the madrigal. And it wasn't until Monteverdi that we saw a sort of a seamless melding of these various elements, of these different types of texted forms. So that is to say, an aria, a madrigal, monody, recitative, arietta, arioso, choral numbers, all these various things that we don't even think about when we're listening to an opera, all the various forms, and the delineations of those forms, the way that they form together to create a seamless dramatic work. These were essentially invented by Monteverdi. So let's talk a little bit about him. So he was born in Cremona in what was, he's considered an Italian composer, of course, but Italy did not exist as a unified state at that time. Much like many other composers of this era and many other artists, we have virtually no record of his early training other than he worked in a cathedral in Cremona and therefore would have had access to teaching from there. He wound up being hired as a court musician for the dukedom of the duchy rather, of Mantua. And there he was a servant of Vincenzo Gonzaga, who was the Duke then of Mantua. And he commissioned, in fact, the first opera that Monteverdi would write, L'Orfeo, based on, again, Orpheus and Eurydice. And this happened, of course, after he was appointed as Master of Music in 1601. He would leave after Vincenzo's death, and his son would take over as Duke. And the two of them actually had quite a bad relationship, and he wound up moving to the Republic of Venice as director at St. Mark's Basilica. He wrote, I believe, 12 operas in his lifetime, but only 3 of them unfortunately survive, and those 3 are Poppea, Ulysses, The Return of Ulysses, and The Coronation of Poppea. And what's interesting is that Poppea fits into a very distinct category of its own. Now, we don't know a whole lot about the other operas that he wrote, but we know that they mostly sort of tended to be of the traditional Aristotelian philosophical genre, which is to say that they had to be approved by Aristotle in terms of the genre that you pick, the type of dramatic, and this harkens back again to the Florentine Camerata and their interest in recreating Greek drama very specifically. And this usually meant something that would actually persist throughout much of Baroque opera, that these had to be sort of the, not only the triumph of love in dramatic contexts, but also the triumph of virtue, constancy, of good fortune. And Poppea very much does not fit those models. It certainly fits the triumph of love. Nero and Poppea are married at the end, but at the expense of virtue and of decency and of any sort of thing you can call morality. And it marks sort of a tradition of this type of anti-hero opera, such as Mozart's Don Giovanni or Verdi's Don Carlos. And in many sense, again, is a kind of a very modern opera in spite of the musical language that Monteverdi, of course, would be using in the Baroque. So I'm going to show you a couple of different types of music that Monteverdi was writing so you can understand the way that he would use sort of all the tools in his arsenal to write an opera like Poppea. So I talked about madrigals, and I wanted to show you one of the sort of mid-period but early in his career madrigals, Cruda Amarili, Cruel Amaryllis. This is what was called the Seconda Partita madrigal, so this sort of advanced harmonic language that Monteverdi used. And what I mean by that is that formal ideas of what you're supposed to do in terms of the technical workings out of the music, like voice leading, unresolved dissonance, all of these things bend to the needs of the poetry, the needs, the emotional needs, the need of expression, of affectation in the poetry. So basically what I'm saying is, don't worry about rules, break them, and write whatever you want so long as it serves the music. And it results in this particular excerpt I'm going to play for you, an extremely expressive type of music. So in addition to the madrigal, this idea of, again, text painting of psychological expression, we have for you this operatic scena, which I wanted to show you as an early example of what he would come to describe more thoroughly in his 8th book of madrigals, the Madrigali Amorosi e Guerrieri, or I think it's the other way around, Madrigali Guerrieri et Amorosi, so madrigals of war and of love. Something that he calls the stile concitato, because what Monteverdi sort of proposed in the writing of music in general is that affect was becoming more important. This is something that would become extremely important in the mid to late Baroque, but maybe less so in the earlier, that he felt that there was plenty of music that expressed calmness, that expressed moderation, but very little that actually successfully or even attempted to express anger. And so in this particular book of madrigals that comes from 1638, it also harkens back to this operatic scena from 1624, the Combattimento de Tancredi e Clorinda, the Battle of Tancredi and Clorinda, which is about two lovers, Tancredi and Clorinda, who wind up on either side of the battle. And I believe that Tancredi kills Clorinda accidentally, believing that she is the enemy. And what we hear in this is this idea of this violent music, of this music that expresses anger, these extremely rapid notes, repetition. And what is interesting about this piece as a whole, this scena, is the fluidity of the idea of recitative, aria, arioso, these sort of different genres of how you can sing. Recitative, of course, being sort of more about getting the words out, speaking about the action of what's going in the aria, being the expressive part, and the aria sort of being somewhere in between the two. So this is the stile concitato. I'm sorry, not concitato. Sorry, concitato. I'm thinking agitato. From the Combattimento dei Templi di Clorinda. You get the idea. It's obviously it's agitated music. Hold on, I'm getting something in the chat. How many are you watching? I'm not sure what that means. Anyway, getting back to this stile concitato. So the intent of this type of music, the intent of this sort of aggressive style is in fact sort of this quandary between the relationship between music and text, because you see text is able to be very specific, right? We can describe a literal action that happens, whereas music is much better at giving a general impression of something. And in the case of the stile concitato, right, this is an attempt to express the anger, the violence of war, something that's much more sort of difficult to describe through music. It has sort of a very frenetic, kinetic, whatever you want to call it, affect. And this is something that becomes more and more important in the Baroque as we move forward, especially again towards the 1700s. So this is an important element of Monteverdi's music, the idea of affect, as he goes on later. And then I thought it was important, of course, to show you a aria from L'Orfeo, from his first opera. This is Tu sei morta from Act 5, where finally Orfeo has to sort of come to terms with the fact that he will lose Eurydice forever.
Respiro, tu sperame partita, sperame partita per mai più non tornare, ed io rimango, no, che se al versi alcuna cosa ponno, andrò sicura più profondi abissi. intenerito il cor del re dell'ombre, ecco tra notti a rivedere stelle. O se ciò negherà miempio destino, rimarrò teco in compagnia di morte. Addio terra, addio cielo e sole, addio.
I think in particular, this work speaks to the sheer expressive power of Monteverdi's vocal writing, honestly. And more than anything, that is what he is interested in, these sort of moments where things sort of coalesce into a single idea. We are able to focus on simply the pain that Orfeo is experiencing, for example, in this particular moment. So much like I mentioned, these are examples of his early and mid style, but as we go on later, I've mentioned these Madrigali Guerrieri et Amorosi from 1638. We see him mixing genres, mixing the madrigal, mixing all these various different types of style of vocal writing, so that they are more able to imitate action, physical action, and express and more varied types of emotion. And what else is going on at the same time is that there's a bit of a sort of philosophical battle between the humanist groups, who were much more, again, Aristotelian thinkers, people who are interested in what the ancients were looking to do, and the people who were more modern, who saw opera as a mixed genre, who saw opera as having many different facets, not just simply recreation of Greek drama. And onto the scene comes Giovanni Francesco Busanello, who was the librettist for L'Incoronazione di Poppea. He already had quite a bit of experience writing librettos. He'd written, I think, 6 or 7 librettos by this point, that he came into writing Poppea. Among them, operas for Cavalli, who was a Baroque French composer, Baroque Italian opera composer. Much to sort of what Monteverdi was interested in, he was going for a more modern taste, a less idea of this classicized drama. And for Poppea, he took Roman history for his point of inspiration, right? Different from Orfeo or Ulysses, which are from classical tradition. And this would impact opera going forward, that there was much more interest in histories and not just mythology. And as I mentioned before, it's hard to ignore the fact that Poppea is sort of saturated in these immoral actions being sort of this perverse triumph of love. Unlike the other two of Monteverdi's last 2 operas, so those are, I mentioned, as The Return of Ulysses, and the other one is the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia. And these two are, again, we don't have the score for the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia, but we do know that both of these operas are much more about the triumph of virtue and of constancy over deceit, over immorality. And the last thing to mention when we are considering this opera, in these 2 operas actually, both Ulysses and Poppea, in relationship to Monteverdi's first opera, L'Orfeo, is that L'Orfeo was written for ducal entertainment, right? It was written for the Duke of Mantua, for a closed private audience. But by the time 1642 and 1643 roll around, opera is a widely popular genre, and that this is for public entertainment, for public consumption. So we see the debasement of people who would have been considered royal figures, the nobility, that would not, of course, necessarily appealed to a noble audience. So I guess the other thing to mention, which is a sort of a side note of interest, is that Busanello was part of a group called the Accademia dell'Incogniti, the Incognito Academy, the Secret Academy, which was a very influential cultural institution in Venice at the time that had sort of these libertine associations. And this, again, sort of just very easily plays into the opera itself. So, unsurprisingly, as I'm sure as I've alluded to, this opera is about Poppea's rise to power, her marriage to Nero, and the opera starts with a prelude between Fortune and Virtue, who argue that they too are the deities, the forces in the world that, in fact, govern everything that happens. But love comes in as Cupid and says, no, you guys have it all wrong. I'm in control here, and let me show you how. And of course, that is sort of the unfolding of the whole opera. So first we have Ottone, who comes, who's pining after Poppea and learns that Poppea and Nero are being unfaithful, because of course Nero is married to Ottavina, the current Empress of Rome. And Ottavia really is aware of this, as is the philosopher Seneca, who advises that tries to reason with all parties to make sure that this happens. What happens eventually is that Nero says to Seneca that he must commit suicide. And so by the time the next act rolls around, Seneca has committed suicide. Ottone has decided that he's going to marry a different woman, Drusilla, who, even though he is in love with her, is not in love with her, is ordered by Ottavina to kill Poppea. And so he goes dressed up as Drusilla, that is to say, Ottone goes and dressed up as Drusilla to assassinate Poppea. She wakes up and she sees what's happening. The guards come, and by the final act, Drusilla is being accused of plotting to murder Poppea. But when it is revealed that, in fact, Ottavina ordered Ottone to kill Poppea and that Drusilla is by virtue complicit, Nero decides to have all three of them banished from Rome. So now, having everybody successfully out of the way, he can go ahead and marry Poppea, and they all live happily ever after. Of course, that's not what happens, which we will get to later. It should also be mentioned that something we'll also get to later is that these events, as it's again sort of comes to be tradition in these types of opera, happen within a single rotation of the earth, that is to say, one day, even though in reality, of course, these events happened over the course of 7 years. So the roles that we have for the opera are Nerone, Nero, who is a soprano, a castrato soprano. For those of you who do not know, due to what you could call clerical error in the literal, in a very literal way, which is to say the clergy, women were not allowed to sing in opera. For, I think, I'm going to get the dates wrong here, so please double check me. But I believe it is about 1400. They were not until till 1750. It's not actually opera. That's wrong. They were not allowed to sing in church. And as a result, what happened is that in order to facilitate the necessary role of sopranos, young boys would be castrated and forced to, of course, their voice wouldn't drop. They would hold these voices. A lot of the time, their voices would crack and just shrivel up. But occasionally, you would get these incredible voices that we don't really know what they sound like. There's a recording of one final castrato. Unfortunately, lower quality because it's from the first half of the century. But even though women, of course, were allowed to sing opera, the castrato voice was so much more popular that it wound up becoming sort of this phenomenon, especially in the works of Handel, where you'd find 3 or 4 castrato roles in a single opera. So the first 2 roles, Ottone and Nerone, are both castrato roles, and usually they're sung by countertenors or sopranos. In our production that we'll be listening today, one of them is actually sung by a tenor, not a countertenor. Then we have Seneca, who's a bass, Poppea soprano, Ottavia soprano, Drusilla soprano. And the work was, we believe, because there are no firm records of this, was premiered at the Carnival season, either in 42 or 43, we believe 43, at the Teatro Santi Giovanni e Paolo. Now, just a quick word on the Baroque orchestra. If you're not aware, these orchestras were much smaller than certainly a classical or a romantic, let alone a 20th century opera orchestra. And usually it would be a series of woodwinds, oboes, flutes, recorders, violins, viola da gamba, bass, so on and so forth. But the most important part of this Baroque style was the foundation, or the basso continuo, which was the harmonic underpinning for the entire for an entire work. And these basso continuo parts would be filled by various instruments: bassoon, harpsichord, organ, theorbo, which is a type of arc lute, or just regular old lutes, guitars, various types of instruments that would realize the harmony, that is to say, fill out the harmony. Another sort of thing to bear in mind when we listen to this music is that not all of the music that you're going to hear is actually written on the page. Not to mention the complication of having a lost manuscript. We don't know what the original manuscript of this looked like. But we know that ornamentation was an incredibly important part of performance practice for this kind of music. I'm just going to show you just a quick, interesting way that Monteverdi did blend style in his opera. So there's a madrigal that occurs in the beginning of Act 2, where the followers of Seneca beg him to not leave. And this is represented by this sort of slowly moving chromatic line, this upward line that represents sort of the pain of his followers at having to see Seneca commit suicide. And this gets to the heart of that sort of emotional text painting that is sort of central to what makes a madrigal a madrigal. So this is sort of the style in which these operas are written. Is sort of, especially this opera, is this sort of a fluidity of different genres, of different types of music that occur throughout the entire work. So let's talk a little bit about the way that this opera works. This is an example, an early example of what we would call mimetic art, which is to say art that imitates reality. Because it's full of this sort of cynical realism that Busanello has written into it, and that Monteverdi fully supports with his musical rendering, which is to say, of course, that the triumph of love over virtue, right, is it's not as sort of an anti-ideal of what these values are supposed to represent in this kind of genre. It also demonstrates the very full range of human emotion in this work. So we see all these different characters that represent very particular things. For instance, we have Nero and Poppea, who are full of this sort of ambition and passion. We have Ottavina, who is this angry, bitter woman, or for instance, Drusilla, who is full of this optimism. And each of them, as they interact with one another, show us different sides of humanity. As promised, this is a musical representation of action, not just of words. So we were talking about the stile concitato before. If we go to this particular section here, we will get a little bit of that warlike music, even in these small ways. We have these two guards on duty who are looking to protect. And they talk about the sort of various conflicts that Nero is getting into and the sort of incompetence that he's handling them with. And we get a little bit of this stile concitato. So again, you hear those little instrumental lines that are occurring underneath, sort of representing that sort of the rioting or the unrest that's happening throughout the country. And of course, under all of this, we detect, the disgruntlement of the servants of Nero. As I mentioned, this work has a porous musical texture, unlike the sort of well-delineated operas that he had written before, or even the well-delineated operas of Handel, where you have a recitative, an aria, a recitative, an aria. There is sort of a more naturalist idea of the drama that, in fact, this is supposed to be a representation of something that is real. That is, and that's another reason for why he chose or Busuello picked this subject matter, something that's a little bit more relatable, something that's actually more close in proximity, not only in time, but in reality, to the humans they would have interacted with on an everyday level. Another part of what Monteverdi uses is this technique of intercalcation, which is to say, repetition of words. And what happens is that you'll get, say, a block of text where Nero and Poppea are having a dialogue. And they sort of will start interrupting one another, as if, especially Poppea to Nero, who will constantly sort of push him in the direction of certain ideas, of certain attempts to persuade, to convince, to charm, to seduce. This I will actually show you at the very end. There's sort of this beautiful aria, or rather duet at the very, very end of the opera, Nero, which exemplifies sort of the complete interlocking of these words, that after all of this pushing, after all of this sort of seduction, there is a resolution, which is, of course, as I've said many times now, the triumph of love. And what's important here to think about when we consider not only this opera, but the other last three operas, because of course Poppea was the last opera that Monteverdi wrote, were the other two operas that he wrote, the Ulysses and the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia, is that, as I mentioned before, these two operas are much more about what we would term sacred love, as opposed to the profane love of Poppea and Nero. And it questions the role of passion in drama, in music, in opera, in whatever context that you have. It forces us to think about what role this has in our life, what we are, what choices we make. And this would have been very different from the way that this music would have been, what would you say, used prior. And I think that I want to address also these two different concepts in Monteverdi's music, the imitazione delle parole, the imitation of words, as opposed to rappresentazione dell'affetto, a representation of affect, of emotion. And this gets to the core of the artistic change that Monteverdi had gone over through approximately 40 years, from the beginning of Orfeo, where the imitation of the musical imitation of the poetry was at the forefront of his mind, at the forefront of many composers' mind, the sort of the affect of how perhaps I speak right now, and being able to set that to music in a convincing way that actually represents the way that speech happens, as opposed to sort of, maybe acknowledging that you want words to reflect how they, the words of an aria, you want them perhaps to reflect how you actually speak, but that is subservient to the expression, kind of like what we were talking about with Cruda Amarili, or really any of the things that we're talking about, that the affect, the variety of emotions is most important. And this is particularly true when we consider the way that Monteverdi characterizes each of the members of the cast. So if we take, for instance, sort of the bitterness of Ottavina. So let's get to her style that she's treated with throughout the opera is of this a much more declamatory, clear style than any of the other characters.
Disprezzata regina, 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 disprezzata. Disprezzata regina del monarca romano, afflitta, afflitta, Che fa? Dove sono? Che penso? Che penso? cicatrina serve. Nerone, Nerone, più Nerone.
But you get the idea. Of course, this is a very sort of, lamenting her fate. On the other hand, there is an example of the sort of impetuousness of Nero versus the sort of calculated, thought, sort of almost pedantic manner of Seneca, which can be found here. If I can get there.
Son risoluto insomma, o Seneca o maestro, di rimover Ottavia dal posto di consorte, e di sposar, e di sposar, e di sposar Poppea. Signor, nel fondo è la maggior dolcezza, spesso giace nascosto il sentimento, consigliere scelerato al sentimento, odia le leggi, e la ragion disprezza, la ragione misura rigorosa, per chiubi si et dolon, per si comanda. Anzi, ragionevole comando, distrugge l'obbedienza. Lascia i discorsi, io voglio amor mio. Non irritare il popolo, il Senato.
And this is particularly evident in an earlier scene where Ottavina, one of her servants, and Seneca have a very quick trade-off of characters, and you'll see how dramatic this is in this particular scene.
Soccorso la nostra regina, in fede mia, che va accendati il fuoco, che va accendati il fuoco, che va accendati il fuoco, e nella barba e nella libreria, in fede mia. Ormone evidenti, servono solo a inviare mar offenti delle regie grandezze si vede.
But you see, again, the very porous nature of this, as if it's happening in real life, as if it's a real sort of course, with massive artistic liberties, sort of a representation of real people behaving as true characters. So when we think about these character representations, we have to remember that these are, by and large, of course, very, there's huge liberties taken with both the history and the characters. Of course, this character of Drusilla does not even exist in real life. She actually comes from a separate fictional comedy. But Bussuelo predominantly based his rendering on Tacitus's annals, various histories, and, as I mentioned, fictional characters. And the reason why he, of course, took the 7-year period and smashed it into the course of one day is because it's an opera. There is a naturalism that he's trying to strike, as I've mentioned. But more than anything, there's a dramatic irony, because what does not happen in the opera, which does happen in real life, is that Nero murdered Poppea by kicking her to death while she was pregnant. This was a fact that was well known to the populace and well known to just the everyday person. It was also known that Nero later committed suicide, and this sort of blissful harmony that is being represented by their union is all hollow. It all means kind of nothing. That in fact, that is the purpose of this sort of amoral story, is that in fact we know what happens. That's the irony of the story that's being proposed. As I've mentioned, of course, Monteverdi is extremely effective at not only sort of giving us this lovely dramatic structure, but also really creating characters that we can believe, characters that have music that is dedicated to them, essentially. And so the question remains for us, and this is something that I've been pondering for a while, is this a comedy or is this a tragedy? Is this a farce or is it something in between? And they actually called it a drama musicale, which is this sort of ambivalent term that doesn't really define it as anything in particular. And that again is sort of a key point of this whole opera, is the ambiguity, the ambivalence of morality. And I think it's important to also bear in mind that because Italy was a series of essentially different types of states, that this would have been presented in the Republic of Venice, that it would have been very much on the minds of the people who were watching the premiere of this work, that there was going to be a comparison made between the morals and the sort of way of functioning that the Republic of Venice had, compared to the sort of papal dictatorship that existed in Rome. So this could have been seen as a political statement that, in fact, the way that we do things over here in Venice is much better than the way that they do things over in Rome. That was true then, and that's true now. As for, in particular, the character of Poppea, it is hard to say, in terms of how much her role. She advises Seneca to be dismissed. And of course this winds up in his forced suicide. She is attempted to be murdered, in which case, when she discovers what happened, when she wakes up, she is the reason for the exile of those three of the court. So it's hard to say necessarily that she is clearly a femme fatale in terms of her sort of actions, but the way that she comes off, she is the undoing of a court. She's the undoing of Nero. She's the undoing of all these various people. But as I said, it's complicated, of course, by sheer fact of what happened after the events of this opera. So I just wanted to close out our meeting today with this gorgeous duet from the end of the opera, Nero, which gets us to an interesting fact about this opera, which is that we actually are not entirely sure of the authenticity of how much of the opera Monteverdi wrote, because we know that Monteverdi would have written, we know for a fact that he wrote most of it, but we also know that he was 73, that he probably was struggling to be able to complete an entire opera by himself. And this particular duet, we actually suspect may not have been originally by Monteverdi. This is complicated further, of course, by the fact that there is no manuscript that we can refer to. Or rather, no original manuscript. I should be very clear. We do have manuscripts, just not the original document. But we suspect that composers such as Cavalli would have, and other younger students, younger composers of than his generation, would have been very involved with the process of writing this piece. It's almost like he was directing it, directing the creation of the opera, just as much as he was writing it. So here is the final duet, the final musical part of l'incoronazione di Poppea, pur temere pur piccolo. Well, there you have it. That's our opera for this week, for this month. But our final two operas of this particular series are going to be Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, and then in February, Bizet's Carmen for our last two Femme Fatales. And then we will be letting you know about more classes in the future. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to the next time. Thanks for coming.